In time, motor cars were appearing on roads in the area. Mail that had been delivered by pack horse began to be delivered by car, and in 1918 the Omeo mail car service began. It wasn't perfect. The mail car often missed the train from Melbourne, but at least it was a vast improvement on the pack horses. 3 local residents bought the town's first cars, and everyone predicted they'd all be killed. I must admit it wasn't long before I got one. In time, T-model Fords would have become the most popular, and before long, only 2 bullock wagons remained in the transport business. In 1914, Omeo suffered its first setback. It was a very dry season throughout Australia. Crops had failed throughout the Shire, and in the next few months, large numbers of cattle and sheep perished. At a time when people were leaving in considerable numbers, and a lot were unemployed, World War I was declared. A total of 232 of Omeo's young men enlisted. Many of these became casualties. 44 were killed, and many others never returned to the Shire. That year, many of the mines that were once flourishing closed down. The boom was over. But life went on. Francis Perry, the town's chemist, became the first person to have a telephone installed in 1909. And street lighting was improved with new Gloria lamps in place of the old kerosene lamps that lit up the streets. I developed an interest in photography that would eventually become a passion. I seemed to be reasonably successful at it, with many people lining up for portraits and so on, and it gave me a lot of satisfaction in capturing the times and events of the day. I had bought the store I originally managed and also set up a profitable bakery shop. I must mention the fact that I had to rebuild the bakery after a disastrous fire in 1931 that not only destroyed my shop but also the chemist, causing some degree of hardship to the town. Any hardships were soon overcome by preparations for the grand celebrations that were to become the Omeo Centenary in 1935, the Back to Omeo celebrations. It was certainly quite an occasion. The town was dressed up from top to bottom with flags and bunting along the main street, and extra lighting installed everywhere you could hang a lamp. Hundreds of people made the journey to Omeo from as far away as Queensland, and soon became known as the Comebacks. A grand parade welcomed them and kicked off a continuous program of activities that included back-to-school events, fancy dress dances, concerts, sports events, and plenty of dancing that had the Memorial Hall shaking to its very foundations. Even an hour-long deluge of rain on Saturday night that had campers scrambling for higher ground along the banks of the Livingston Creek couldn't dampen the enthusiasm of the grand event. It was a wonderful time. The year of 1939 began in a summer that was abnormally hot, the hottest I could remember. It had followed an exceptionally dry spring, and forest floors throughout the state were thick with undergrowth and accumulated debris. It was the middle of an extreme heat wave, and the entire country was tinder dry. Literally hundreds of fires had been tormenting brigades everywhere across Victoria. In the immediate Omeo region, small fires had been controlled by a bush fire brigade that consisted largely of knapsack sprays, beaters and rakes, shovels and axes. But it was a more sinister blaze burning uncontrolled in the mountains to the west, expanding across a 40-kilometre front that worried the town's councillors. Lightning strikes caused by summer storms had ignited the tinder-dry bush weeks before, and the fire was running its own course, at its own pace. Smoke had been in the air for days, and I remember at night an ominous red glow that lit up the distant skyline. By mid-morning on Friday the 13th, Strong westerly winds had turned to a gale. The temperature was well on its way to 45.6 degrees. I certainly couldn't remember when it had done that before. Fires burning to the west of Omeo had joined into one huge inferno that was showering the township with burning embers. It had ripped through the chalet at Mount Hotham and was crossing the Alps at a frightening speed. Within 35 minutes, it would be at Omeo. By midday, the fire brigade, with all able-bodied men, had retreated from the front to the town's perimeter. The sun was long obliterated, and the air was black and heavy with smoke. At about 8:30 in the evening, the fire roared up the slopes of the mountains, up Mount Mesley and over the top, and down onto the town. Sheets of flame leapt from the mountain across the creek and swimming pool and hit buildings, shops, houses, businesses in a firestorm that exploded through them in minutes. The Livingston Creek glowed red as eucalyptus gases exploded overhead. Boiling winds filled with soot and debris hit into the faces of terrified residents who could do nothing more than watch as the destruction whirled around them. Charles Duvay, Arthur Greenwood and Darcy Fitzgerald and many other of my friends could only watch as their homes were swept up in the flames. Slater's Cafe was saved, but Haylock's boot shop was destroyed, as was Schultz's arcade. Drums containing 5,000 gallons of petrol exploded, adding to the roar of the flames, obliterating Sandy's store. Firefighters working 30 metres away battled on, undeterred, desperately trying to save whatever they could. Flames raced over open ground towards the hospital. Matron Lee and her nursing staff and volunteers frantically began to evacuate the hospital's inpatients. Many were given morphine to ease their pain and fears. Dr. Gordon Little, who had recently arrived as the Shire's medical officer, was facing the toughest challenge of his career, supervising the arrival of the patients at a makeshift facility at the Hilltop Hotel on the town's eastern end. 20 people, including a growing number of burns victims, were made as comfortable as possible. Within an hour of being transferred from the burning hospital, Charlie McNamara's wife of Kabungra gave birth to a baby girl in the temporary shelter. Flames licked at the walls of the hospital, and within minutes it was engulfed and entirely destroyed. Constable John Hazel, a long-time resident of the town and its only policeman, did his best to calm men, women and children as they sheltered on the town's public reserve. Firefighters, already exhausted, could only watch as the hurricane of fire began a final attack on Omeo, their home. And then, suddenly, a miracle happened. The winds turned and began blowing from the north, pushing the fire away from what was left of the town. Next morning revealed the extent of the devastation. The landmark Golden Age Hotel, the hospital, 11 shops and 22 houses had been destroyed. Throughout the Shire, 200 houses and huts were lost. 15,000 sheep, 8,000 head of cattle and 200 horses were burnt to death. As the fire had raced towards Omeo, a stockman from Kabungra, Ernest Richards, had set out to try and save his wife and child. The young 30-year-old's charred body was found days later, lying beside the burnt remains of his horse and dog. I was too old to be of much use in fighting the fires, but having acquired a general store and the town's only bakery, I made available free bread to the hospital, and in fact to anyone who needed it, until the town was back on its feet. But in fact, Omeo never did recover. 8 months after the fires, World War II started, and once again young men answered the call and left the town, most of them never to return. I buried a son, Lewis, in September of 1943, one of my 10 children. As for me, well, because I had been born in Germany all those years ago, even at the age of 76 and beyond, I had to report to the local police station twice a day, just like I did in World War I. It was of no great concern to me. In fact, I found it rather amusing. I'd arrived here in February 1881 and long considered myself to be more of an Australian citizen than a few others I've met on my journey.